Hello and welcome to the Week in Politics with Michelle Grattan. I'm Caroline Fisher, Associate Professor of Journalism at the University of Canberra. Hello Michelle.
Hi Caroline.
Nice to see you in the flesh again in the studio.
Indeed, it's been a long time.
It has been a long time. In fact, I came into my office today for the first time after months and there were two, petrified mandarins sitting on my desk, but my pot plant was alive. So anyway, a long time since I've been in the office. Look, this week we've had accusations of political interference with the ABC, Labor's resurrecting the NBN debate, and also the religious discrimination bill has re-emerged. But look, let's start with the ABC. So the chair of the ABC, Ita Buttrose, claims the federal government is attempting some political interference with the national broadcaster. Can you tell us more about what that's about?
Well, of course, the ABC has had a fraught relationship with the government for a very long time over a number of issues, not least the whole Christian Porter saga, but others too. Now, what's happened is that a Liberal backbencher, Andrew Bragg, who chairs a Senate Committee on Communications, has initiated an inquiry into the ABC's complaints procedure, how it deals with complaints. And Ita Buttrose has really pushed back strongly on this because the ABC actually has an independent inquiry running at the moment on this very issue. And so she sees this as political interference and has come out strongly, publicly. The Prime Minister, who after all appointed Ita Buttrose and praised her to the skies when he did so, has in fact supported Bragg, not Buttrose.
So is Ita right?
I think Ita is right. I think that given the ABC is looking at this question itself, whether it's got an adequate procedure for dealing with complaints, then for the politicians to second guess that and have an inquiry which is due to report before the ABC's one does suggest that it's trying to exert pressure.
Now, it seems that the federal election is well and truly underway.
Very long campaign.
Very long campaign.
Exhausting campaign.
Yes, for everybody. So the government and Labor this week both announced policies, technology-based policies. Labor specifically has returned to the NBN. So what's Labor promising here?
Labor's promising that it would spend more than $2 billion essentially improving the NBN for people in the regions, for people in the suburbs. And of course the NBN, I think, is an issue that is quite popular with people because a lot of households, a lot of small businesses have a service which is not fast enough, not adequate for their needs. And so anything that's holding out an improvement is likely to go down pretty well. But I did think that this announcement didn't really get a great deal of publicity. It was covered, but it pointed to the problem that Labor has really in cutting through, I think. Now it's starting to roll out some policy. It's quite late in doing this, but it really will need to sell those policies so people know what it's offering. I think at the moment the impression of the opposition that people have is a very undefined, fuzzy sort of impression, and whether Anthony Albanese can sharpen that up adequately remains to be seen. But he doesn't have a lot of time, even with a May election, the latest possible date. Time goes quickly, even though the campaign does seem to drag, I have to say.
You say, though, that that they've left it a bit late in announcing policy, but one of the things happens when the real election campaign starts is that they've got to have something left in the bag, both sides,
true.
For then. And the news media get bored in covering stuff. They say, but you announced that 3 months ago.
Yes.
So it's a
balance.
Difficult,
it is
position.
A balance, and I think that there's also the point that Labor is determined to make itself a small target, so it doesn't want to get measures out there that are either going to be vulnerable to attack or, for that matter, I guess, stolen by the government, on the other hand.
Indeed. Other groups are also, starting to prepare. There's the grassroots independence campaigns building up around the place. There's also a new advocacy group emerging called, let me just get this right here, the Truth and Integrity Project. And I think Barry Jones and John Hewson are both involved in this, designed to highlight what they perceive as the untruths and integrity issues surrounding the Prime Minister.
I think these issues are important, and I do think they're resonating with people. And we have learned this week that the future of the legislation for a National Integrity Commission is very unclear. The government previously said it would introduce the legislation in this final 2 weeks of Parliament, which begins next week. Now it's really fudging what it's going to do with this legislation. I was making inquiries, trying to make inquiries from Attorney General Cash's office this week, and people wouldn't even return calls. So we don't know whether this legislation is going to in fact be brought in before Christmas, or whether it's going to be left for next year, presuming there is a sitting in February, that the election is May, not March, which means that we'd have a sitting in February, and of course we'd have a budget a bit later, or whether it's going to go off into the never, and there was some speculation in the media this morning that that might happen. So that's a big question mark over a very important piece of legislation. We know that the government has been under a lot of criticism for its earlier weaker draft of the Commission, but if we don't get legislation and get it fairly soon, I think that the government will be marked down for that.
That will play into Labor's hands?
Well, absolutely, and they're promising a robust Integrity Commission, and I think that the public have been very disillusioned by political behaviour, and they do want action taken. One of the things that Barnaby Joyce pointed out this week was that the government didn't want a commission looking into executive decisions, ministerial decisions, think sports rorts. So we do know, I think, that the model, even if it's been tinkered with, would still be pretty limited when we finally see it, assuming we finally see it.
The commission you have when you're not having a commission. Well, the other piece of legislation that is occupying the government's mind at the moment is the Religious Discrimination Bill. Now, whether or not the Integrity Bill comes forward, the Religious Discrimination Bill is likely to be discussed
absolutely.
Next week. So can you just remind us about the history of this bill and why it's deemed to be necessary?
Well, it started off when we had the marriage equality plebiscite, and the Conservatives, of course, lost out on that. And Malcolm Turnbull said, well, there'd be some action on religious discrimination. He set up a committee which produced a pretty anodyne report. But then we've had drafts of this legislation. Stakeholders on the Liberal end of the spectrum, small L Liberal end, and the Conservative end didn't like those. There's been a lot of consultation. We don't know the actual wording of the new bill, but we know that the provision that was dealing with the Israel Folau situation has gone. That is someone who was dismissed because of his publicly expressed very strong views which offended many people. Protection was going to be given in that sort of case to the person. Anyway, that's out
gone.
the window.
Clause, yep.
And some other matters have been apparently dropped. So it does look as though it's a pretty mild bill, but nevertheless, whether there'll be some ruckus about it in the coalition party room remains to be seen next week, but certainly the government does intend to press ahead with it. Scott Morrison, I think, is pretty heavily invested in this. He regards it as an election promise, and also Labor is under pressure actually to come to the party and take a bipartisan attitude. The National Catholic Education Commission this week came out urging Labor to support it. The executive director of that commission is Jacinta Collins, who's a former Labor senator, and they are concerned about Victorian legislation, proposed measure that they say could interfere with Catholic schools' rights to hire people who are compatible with their faith and values. So there's a lot of pressure all round on this legislation. I think Labor will be anxious, if possible, to accommodate it, because again we get back to the small target issue, and it doesn't want this issue of the religious discrimination legislation carrying on. It would rather get that out of the way. And there's another factor too, that this issue plays quite strongly in Western Sydney with ethnic communities. And after the last election, Chris Bowen went out of his way to make the point that some in Western Sydney did, or some faith-based groups and individuals did feel that the progressive side of politics didn't have enough regard to them. Now he holds a Western Sydney seat. So a lot of factors at play there.
And there's another piece of controversial legislation before the Parliament next week, and that's the requirements for voters to produce ID at the ballot box. Do you think this is going to be successful?
I think its fate is unclear. The government is very anxious to get it through and get it through quickly. Labor is opposed and will try and get the numbers to defeat it. It says that it discriminates against Indigenous communities and other people, like homeless people, for example, who might be able to produce ID readily. Although, on the other side, people do make the point that enrolment's compulsory and you need ID for enrolment. So it's only a fairly short step to producing it at the ballot box, and there are some safeguards. But anyway, regardless, it has a lot of opponents, and so it will be up to the crossbench, and anyone who predicts the Senate crossbench is a very brave or a very rash person. There's another complication, and that is that Pauline Hanson is having a bit of a hissy fit at the moment. She's upset about vaccine mandates at various levels, and she says she's going to produce mayhem in the Senate. And also there are a couple of rogue coalition backbenchers who are also upset about vaccine mandates, and they say they're going to withhold their vote on government legislation until the Prime Minister does something about these mandates, which of course are mainly, of course, not federal government ones, but state government ones, and so the Prime Minister's remit there's pretty limited.
So in fact he made quite strong statements yesterday, which he was criticised for, to say, you know, the federal government, you know, we don't believe in mandates, and we don't believe in telling people what to do.
Well, whether the rogue senators were tuning in is not clear.
Okay, look, thanks so much, Michelle. I really look forward to speaking to you again in a fortnight.
Thanks, Caroline.